Hello everyone and welcome back to another 2 a.m. review. So if I stumble over my words, that is why. But we're here to talk about Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, the brand new movie from Lucasfilm and Disney. That is the final film, the final outing for Harrison Ford as this character. And I was very scared to watch this movie because, of course, you heard the reviews coming out of the Cannes Film Festival back a few months ago, and it was very, very mixed, to be nice about the reviews. But slowly the reviews have gotten slightly better. But in general, the consensus of this movie has been you either really like it or you don't like it or you're somewhere in the middle. So I was terrified to watch this film, and after watching it, I'm glad I lowered my expectations because I did end up enjoying this movie. And I think the ending is going to be something that's going to be very controversial amongst fans, and I cannot wait to talk about it with you guys because I find a lot of the thematic elements when it comes to the ending of this film very fascinating. And so, of course, this will be a spoiler review for this movie. So if you've not seen Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, I would recommend go checking it out in theaters, especially if you're a fan of the series. I definitely think this is better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And honestly, I don't really like Temple of Doom too much. I don't really ever care to rewatch that film. And I'm excited to rewatch this film to kind of see how the story progresses and how the little details that were spread out throughout the entire movie kind of lead to the ending of the film. So I don't know, I might like this more than Temple of Doom. I need to rewatch that movie again, but this movie is definitely not at the level of Raiders of the Lost Ark and Last Crusade. So how does this movie begin? Well, it starts off with actually the 20-minute long sequence that is the younger flashback of Indiana Jones during the end of World War II, and you get to see him and his friend Shaw infiltrating this train to try to get this artifact away from the Nazis, which is a very Indiana Jones thing to do, so it feels very classic Indiana Jones. In terms of the CGI, de-aging thing, I think it looked pretty good for the most parts. There's definitely some parts that look animated. Whenever he talks, it's not great, but they do a good job at trying to keep him from talking during this entire sequence, so I honestly didn't mind, because if you look at it story-wise and how it sets up the villain and the story of this movie, I think it does a pretty good job of setting up all that stuff. It's a very fun, exciting way to kick off your Indiana Jones film with a Harrison Ford that you're used to seeing, the one that is more young and more spry and can actually fight the Nazis in a way that you want him to fight the Nazis, and so it's a very fun sequence to begin the movie. But then, of course, you cut to Harrison Ford as the 79-year-old man living in his apartments, being a very grumpy old man, hearing the young kids, blasting music at 8 a.m. and being very grumpy about that. And you get to establish where his character is at this point in his life. Of course, they split up Marion and Indiana Jones once again. They're not together by the end of, or by the beginning of this movie, and so we get to find out exactly what happened to them sporadically throughout the entire movie, but that is where he's at in this point in his life. And also what's going on in the world at this point is also the moon landing. This is 1969 New York City, and so there's a lot of parades going on around the city and a lot of excitement about the history that's being made, although Indiana Jones has no interest in that whatsoever. I think if anything, this first act does a great job at setting up the storylines and setting up the character arc for Harrison Ford throughout this entire movie. Of course, that opening sequence sets up the villain played by the great Mads Mikkelsen as a Nazi scientist, a great villain to have in this movie because, of course, Mads Mikkelsen is great at playing villains, although one day I want to see him play the hero of the story. But the first act does a great job at establishing the arc of Harrison Ford, beginning at a point where he is stuck in the past. This is the thematic element of this movie, and I think when it comes to the story of this film, when it comes to the writer's room, when they first were pitching the idea of making one last Indiana Jones movie with a 79-year-old Harrison Ford, you're going to have the idea of time, you're going to have the idea of aging, and you're going to have all those themes that come with that. And with every single Indiana Jones movie, of course, you're going to have some sort of supernatural element that happens at the end of the film. Of course, the first film had the Ark of the Covenant and had the religious themes, and once it was opened, everybody who looked at it died horrible deaths. Of course, when it comes to Temple of Doom, you have the cult thing with the guy ripping the hearts out of the characters inside of that movie. And of course, with Last Crusade, you have the Fountain of Youth, which is a very obsessed over artifact throughout the entire history, throughout media in general. And you have the storyline where Henry Jones and his son Indiana Jones have this divide between them because of that obsession that Henry Jones had over the Fountain of Youth. And so there's a lot of thematic elements when it comes to that as well. And so now you're pitching this idea for a fifth Indiana Jones movie with time. Of course, you're going to have time travel in this movie. Spoilers alert. Spoilers alert? Spoiler alert, that is what the Dial of Destiny does. It travels through time, which I'll get into the ending and why I don't think that jumps the shark as much as the whole interdimensional beings from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Although I do think it can jump the shark for some audience members, especially if you have that idea planted in your head that if the Indiana Jones movies decide to do anything that's outlandish and that's science fiction, it's instantly bad. I don't think it is bad because of the thematic elements that they set up in this first act. Of course, you're introduced to Helena Shaw, played played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge in the first act of this movie as well. She plays the goddaughter of Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones. She is the daughter of the Shaw character that was in the opening train sequence, and so you get to see what her dynamic is. You don't really know where her allegiance necessarily lies, because her first act in this movie is to steal the dial from Harrison Ford and to kind of lock him with the bad guys, and so you don't really know where her allegiance lies, because she just wants to steal these artifacts and sell them for as much money as possible to try to make a lot of money and become infamous in this world of archaeology. And this entire sequence in New York with Phoebe Waller-Bridge, jumping across the rooftops and then going through the parade and riding a horse away from trains, all this stuff feels very Indiana Jones. I love seeing, this sort of style of adventure movie in this time period in the 60s, and so I loved a lot of this first act. I think it really does lay the groundwork for the villain with the opening sequence with the train stuff. I think it lays the groundwork for the character arc with Harrison Ford and the theme of time and aging, and I think it really does set up a decently, intriguing character for Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and so I was so on board for the first act of this movie. And the second act of this movie does kind of hit or miss at some points of it, because it feels a little bit too repetitive. It is definitely one of those things where it feels like James Mangold was making an Indiana Jones movie, so he has to do all the Indiana Jones type of things. You need to have the plane sequence where it's flying over the map and you see the red line going across the map from one location to the next. You have all these different puzzles that they're trying to get to the MacGuffins of the movie, and when this movie becomes MacGuffins the movie, it gets a bit repetitive, because of course, the entire opening sequence is trying to get the original dial, the first piece of the dial that was found by the Nazis in Germany in World War II, and so you have that dial is now gone, but you need to find this little tablet thing that'll tell you where to get the other half of the dial in order to create it, to put it together to be able to do the things that the villain wants to do in this movie. So now you have to go on this entire sequence to try to get this tablet thing, and of course the villains are going to get to them at the very end, and that's pretty much how every single sequence goes. You have the main characters going off to get this artifact, the villains swoop in at the last minute. Whether they get the artifact or not is up to whatever the sequence lies in, and they go off to get to the next artifact in the next sequence. And so it feels very repetitive, because this happens in the first act, and the second act it happens twice, and they go to the final place to find the final artifact, and it just feels like we've been there and done that, and it stops having the great moments that has to deal with the aging Harrison Ford. And it's like I said, it sporadically told the story about how Indiana Jones and Marion broke up, because you get to hear about Mutt Williams and how he is now dead. This movie kills off Mutt Williams off screen. Essentially, he went off to war in spite of Indiana Jones. There's some beef going on between these two characters, and so he went off to war. He ended up dying, and Harrison Ford essentially blames himself for it. He shuts down. He's stuck in the past. He buries himself in his work, and Marion has nobody to grieve with. And we don't get to see any of this. This is all just told in exposition sporadically throughout the entire second act, and I think this is a massive missed opportunity to not see Marion until the very end of the movie, because she is in the movie. The actress pops up at the very final scene, and I just wish you got to see at least one or two conversations between these two characters throughout this movie that's kind of set up this conflict, because it feels not necessarily earned by the time you get to the ending of the film. And it's not like I hated any of the sequences in the second act. It does feel like this movie's trying to imitate being an Indiana Jones movie. They're like, okay, well, we're making another Indiana Jones movie. Let's do all the things. Let's go make them find some MacGuffins. Let's make them do some puzzles. Let's make them, go through this room of all these creatures. You get to see the eels underwater, which I did like the underwater sequence quite a bit with Antonio Banderas. It's nice to see him also in this film. And I was really sad when he was killed in this movie, even though, they don't really have an established relationship between Harrison Ford and this character. Apparently this friendship was built off screen. I did still care about him by the time they shot him, because it is Antonio Banderas, but to see the underwater eels being essentially the snakes of the ocean was a pretty fun idea. But then you get to the other thing where they're doing the puzzles, and the water sinks down, and Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Harrison Ford are working together for the first time in sync with each other, and so you get some fun character moments within these two sequences in the second act, but it just never feels as rousing as the puzzle sequences in Raiders of the Lost Ark in particular. There's so many great things in Raiders of the Lost Ark that just feel like it's just not, the magic's not there for the second act. Even though I did enjoy watching, it's like I'm watching an Indiana Jones movie in 2023, and it's really cool to see Harrison Ford, even though he's at 79 years old, he's doing all these things that feel like he shouldn't be doing because he's so old, but it's still fun to watch him playing this character. It just feels like it went on a little bit too long. I do think this movie is a bit too long. It's 2.5 hours long, and if anything, I would cut out one of these sequences and maybe add some more character stuff instead. And of course, hearing John Williams' final score in film, which is very sad to see him go as a composer, but of course he went out with Indiana Jones, which is honestly probably my favorite score of his. I'd have to kind of look through his filmography because he is one of the most talented people on the planet in the history of the world, and so it's very sad to see this as his last movie, but I do love his themes in this movie. I think he did a phenomenal job making this feel like a fun Indiana Jones movie throughout the entire thing, especially in the second act. But at this point in the movie, we got the first half of the Dial of Destiny from the Nazis in Germany that was given to Shaw, that was then taken by Harrison Ford to then, put in storage in the university, that was then stolen and stolen again and stolen again, and now they have it. The Nazis have this piece of the dial, and they got the tablet thing that led them to the other half of the dial, and you got to the tomb of Archimedes, and you put the dial together, and now we've reached the ending of this movie. What does this dial do? Like I said, it's time travel. Of course, this movie has time travel in it. I feel like we all assumed that this movie was going to have time travel in it based on the title and based on the trailer and based on the theme of time. Like I said, when it comes to, writing a story for an Indiana Jones movie at this point, you're going to dive into the thematic elements of time, and so I just think it makes sense to do a time travel story, but that is where it will split the audience of whether or not that jumps the shark. I think the first 3 Indiana Jones movies feels more like fantasy than sci-fi, whereas the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and now this movie feels a little more sci-fi than fantasy, but this movie also does still have some fantastical elements with how this style actually works, and so let's just dive into exactly what happens with the last act of this film. Essentially, Mads Mikkelsen's plan was to get this dial back together, to go back to 1939, to kill Hitler. He didn't want to kill Churchill or any of the other, Allied leaders. He wanted to kill Hitler because, he started the fire that will burn the world down, but he made a lot of mistakes along the way, and his hubris got to him, and he ended up being the reason why the Nazis lost. It's not that the Allies won, he thinks that Hitler lost the war, and so he wants to go ahead and kill Hitler, take over, and complete his, reign across the world in the way that he envisions it. And so that is his plan, essentially. He gets the dial, he dials in that time, he does the math equation, and they go through this thing that looks a lot like the Millennium Falcon in Solo, but that's a funny little visual reference, I guess, at least. But once they go through this portal, it brings them to the 200 something BC. You get to see the war going on in Sicily. You get to see the Romans doing all the things, and you get to actually meet Archimedes. That's exactly the time period that this dial is meant to go to. It's not like you can put in any sort of time period and go wherever in history you want to go. It leads to Archimedes because he wanted help in this war, and so that's where they appear. And these planes are flying through this time period where there should not be any planes, and all the people think it's dragons flying through the sky. And this is where the movie didn't really lose me, but I was like, I don't know how I feel about this in the moment, because there's planes flying in 200 BC. They're calling it dragons. There's some Nazis falling out of the plane, and are these people found later on in the years, and you get to see Nazis that were thousands and thousands of years old. I don't really know how I felt about it in the moment. It does feel jarring when it happens, even though you feel like this is leading to a time travel story the entire time. By the time it happens, you're like, wow, we're really doing this now. But I do think this ending will kind of land differently with everybody who watches this film. Some people will like it, some people won't like it at all. I was kind of in the middle at first because it felt a little goofy when they're calling it dragons, but you know what? That makes sense with the time period. They're kind of freaking out at seeing these things flying through the air on fire, and so there's all these sort of things that's happening here that's maybe is a little bit weird, maybe is a little bit right, but it's cool to see Indiana Jones actually seeing the past, seeing the history that he has loved so deeply through all of his entire life. And when it comes to the theme of this character and the arc that he goes on being stuck in the past, he wants to stay here. He does not want to leave. He wants to, experience all these things. This is what he's dreamed of his entire life, was to be in the past and to learn all the things that he could never learn. And when he meets Archimedes, he's like, can I stay with you? I want to be here. I don't want to go back home. And you get a great sequence where Phoebe Waller-Bridge is pleading with him to not stay. She does not want him to essentially give up his life and stay here. She does not want to lose him like she lost her father. And again, the development between these characters, I think during the second act could have been a lot stronger. I wish I cared a little bit more about these characters and their relationships by the time we got to this speech, but either way, I do think this moment is pretty emotional. My biggest problem with the ending of this film is not the idea that they go back in time. Like I said, if you're building a story around Harrison Ford aging and the theme of time, of course, an Indiana Jones movie with the supernatural elements is going to choose time travel to explore those themes, but Harrison Ford doesn't make the decision to go back home. He gets punched in the face by Phoebe Waller-Bridge and is dragged home against his will. And I think that is where this movie makes the fatal mistake by the ending of this film, because I think if he were to be convinced to go back home, to give Marion another shot, to realize that he was stuck in the past, and to realize that he can experience the history that's happening right now in the real world, I feel like that would have sold the ending for me a little bit more, because it kind of just punched in the face. He wakes up in his bed and you never really get to see the escape. But of course, this is where Marion comes in and you get to see them have this rekindling relationship. You get to see that funny moment where Harrison Ford moves the magnet off of her face on the fridge very subtly. You get to see the references to Raiders of the Lost Ark with their, romance that was sparked in that film with, the kissing the elbow and seeing where it hurts, and all of it hurts because they're old now. But it's a really cute reference to the first movie. And so the scene in general, I think it is well written. I just don't think it was developed and earned by this movie itself. I feel like this movie could have done so much more with the characters of Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Marion. And honestly, I feel like if they took the approach of this movie that's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull approach, which is, to have Marion and have Harrison Ford, broken up by the beginning of this movie and they're forced together to go on this adventure together, maybe that final scene would have worked, having them rekindle that relationship. Again, I think Crystal Skull's existence kind of hurts that idea because we've already done that, and so now you're introducing this new character that can possibly have some spin-offs, which I wouldn't honestly mind to see Phoebe Waller-Bridge in a spin-off of Indiana Jones. I can see that happening. I can also see, Ke Huy Quan, have his own spin-off for Short Round. I really hope that happens one day on Disney Plus, but who knows if that will ever happen. He's not in this movie, unfortunately, but I feel like he was a little bit too far into production by the time he blew up and he started acting again for them to insert him into this movie. And honestly, I don't think he necessarily had a place in this story. So who knows if they're going to do some spin-offs with either Phoebe Waller-Bridge or Ke Huy Quan, or if they're going to continue the Indiana Jones legacy in any sort of way with an animated series or anything like that. As of right now, this is the very ending of it, and I'm glad it exists. I know a lot of people are, hesitant on the existence of this movie in the first place, but I feel like this is a much better, ending to the story of Indiana Jones than Crystal Skull was. And I think that's in large part due to Harrison Ford's performance in this film and the way they handled his arc. Like I said, I really like his arc in this film, that kind of focus on age and time and the theme that it has with him stuck in the past, and the story of meeting back with Marion. And again, it may not have the greatest execution, but I like the idea of it. I like it on paper, and I do think it's executed just well enough for me to not, be upset at this movie like I was after watching Crystal Skull. And so I do think this movie is warranted. I do think it has a reason to exist. I do think Harrison Ford is amazing as this character, and I'm really glad I got to see him on the big screen one last time as this character. It was just a really fun adventure movie that had a little rough patches here in the second act, felt a little bit too long, but overall I had a lot of fun with it, and I did enjoy the ending, and I will defend that ending because it is thematically resonant to the main character's character arc. Also, in the tradition of Indiana Jones movies, Mads Mikkelsen's character died a very, very brutal death with the plane diving down and blowing up, and you get to see his burnt corpse on the ground found by Archimedes, who takes his watch, and that's why Archimedes had the watch in the tomb. Although there is a few continuity errors. I feel like before she gets punched or before Harrison Ford gets punched in the face by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, I feel like she tried to give that watch back to Harrison Ford, but it was on Archimedes' wrist in the tomb. And then there's also the thing where they were escaping the tomb and the bridge had fallen earlier in the movie and the bridge was all of a sudden back up. There's a few plot holes in this movie that I think you can nitpick and point out and say that's an issue. And the fact that I noticed it on first watch is pretty glaring. But again, besides that, this is a fun watch. I would recommend you guys go watch it. If you watch this entire spoiler review trying to figure out if you wanted to watch it or not and you didn't care about spoilers, well, there you go. It's a recommendation from me. So that's going to be my review for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Definitely comment down below all your thoughts, good or bad, about this movie. I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about especially the ending in general. Did you guys think that the thematic resonance of this ending warranted the idea of time travel, or do you think that this movie jumped the shark once again with time travel and with interdimensional beings rather than the whole, Holy Grail or Ark of the Covenant stuff that were in the original film? So I'm very curious to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I just reviewed Flash, I just reviewed Secret Invasion last week, and so I have a bunch of reviews on this channel. I'll of course be reviewing Mission Impossible, and of course Insidious 5 comes out next week, so that will be probably my next review that I do here on this channel. So thanks everybody for watching this video. Like, subscribe, leave comments, do all the things, and I hope to see you all in my next one.